Okay. Okay, so today's talk is, well, I watched half of the new Star Trek Picard yesterday. I didn't get through the whole half of the first episode. And well, I've been talking with my friends and we haven't been eating bacon, but we were looking at the way Picard eats bacon. Well, didn't eat bacon, but they use. Well, this is a spoiler alert. If you haven't seen the first episode, it's really minor. It's not a really big spoiler at all. It's just kind of okay. Well, here it is. Picard, when this episode begins, he's at his ancestral estate in France, with all the. It's a big stone house on the verge of being a mansion. It's quite large, and he's got a staff that looks after him. And, it's the farm. Well, what do you call it? It's a vineyard. It's a huge vineyard, all kinds of wine vines. And, Picard is famous for drinking Earl Grey tea. So, sure enough, it's just like being on the Galaxy class starship. He uses a replicator in his big stone mansion to make a cup of Earl Grey tea. Now, my friends and I were talking about this, and we said, geez, that's stupid. I mean, this is a beautiful old building. It's not a new building, even in today's standard. This is an old building made of stone from 1875. And I'm sure it has a traditional kitchen. But Picard doesn't boil water and, make tea the old fashioned way. He uses a replicator. So we started thinking about replicated food. And, on a starship, it makes sense to replicate food because you don't have huge greenhouses and a farm where you're going to have cows that are going to give you milk. So they use this technology to create food from. Now, they don't explain replicators, but at one time I did look up replicators. And I think on a Galaxy class, they replicate from. I don't know. But the other kind of replicator is the kind of replicator talked about by Corey Goode, the person who says there's a secret space program, and that some of the secrets, well, more than one secret space program, but humans who have gone off world and have a breakaway civilization, and they're up to 1,000 years ahead of us on planet Earth as when it comes to technology. So, in Corey Goode's version of a replicator, what you do is you take organic material as a base substance, and then you use a replicator to change it into something edible. But in Corey Goode's version, you have to have an organic substance. So maybe they use like green slime or something, just a primitive. It does. It's nothing. You don't do you understand what I mean? I mean, you have to have the stuff. Maybe it's used cooking oil or something. Like those biodiesel buses or something. But that's what they use. But on Star Trek, I don't think that's the way it works. But anyway, so we started thinking about it, and even modern day, our time period, we were talking about the way that things have gone in our world. We used to have local bakeries. You had bakeries in your own city, and if you got within 4 blocks of the bakery, you could smell baking bread, and it was lovely. But because we have enormous corporations that run the grocery stores, they put the small bakeries, the city size, I mean, they're not that small. If it's big enough to feed a whole city, but they put the city size bakeries and a lot of the small bakeries out of business. So you have one manufacturing plant in a major city that supplies a whole state or a Canadian province or the next province over with bread. So you never get the smell of baked bread anymore. This is progress. No, it's not. But this is enormous corporations and their ways of saving money by mass producing something one place and shipping it somewhere else. So unfortunately, we don't smell nice bread, but this would be something back to the Picard story. If you are replicating bread, you're not going to have the lovely baking smell in your Picard's kitchen in his ancestral home, but they could do it because he's got a staff. And then we were talking about microwaves. I had microwaved green beans the other day, and they were horrible. They were over chewy and not. No one wanted to eat them. We didn't like them. The proper way to make green beans is you boil them in water on the stove. And once they get to, well, they kind of get more green, more of a deep green color. And at the appropriate time, you take the green beans out of the boiling hot water and you dip them into a pot of cold tap water to stop the cooking process, and it keeps them green. Then you take them out of the cold water and you saute them in butter. And that is the proper way to make green beans. Now, microwave versus green beans, the way that I just described, is night and day. How did they come out of a replicator? Well, on the original Star Trek, I don't think the food looked too good. They served coffee in paper cups. And, when I was 15, 40 years ago, they served instant coffee out of coffee machines in paper cups. And that's what they drank on the original Star Trek, this kind of instant coffee. No, not good. But, replicated coffee in more modern version of Star Trek, is it going to be as good as, no, it's not going to be good coffee. I'm terribly sorry. Now, I have a personal preference when it comes to coffee. My favorite coffee is if you go in an old school greasy spoon cafe and they brew coffee in a manufacturer. They're called Bunn, Bunn. Bunn coffee brewed is the best. And I don't think they use really, Hawaiian Kona or Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee. They use just, but it's just the fact that it's made properly in that machine and the temperatures are right. At my home, we have a coffee making machine that seems to have lost it. It used to make good coffee, but now it's not getting hot enough. The element's not hot enough, and so the coffee comes out, and then I've got to stick it in the microwave for 20 seconds because it's not hot enough. But I think those Bunn, I always enjoyed their coffee, and it wasn't, I'm raving about it, but it was just being in the Greasy Spoon Cafe where I got bacon and eggs. And I used to have like rye toast. They had like a choice, white bread, brown bread, or rye bread. And I always got rye bread and it was buttered. And then they give you the little small Kraft peanut butters. They're, that big. And, I'd have as many as you want of those Kraft peanut butters and I'd eat that. And I'd drink a bottomless cup. The waitress would come around with, the big carafe of Bunn coffee and, and usually I had like a water. Well, to tell you the truth, I would be there with my drinking buddies. And, the night before we had tied one on and we needed a greasy breakfast because we were hungover. but it did work. A lovely omelet with all the trimmings, and it was cheap in those days. It was so cheap. It was like 6.50 for the whole thing. And it's such a good value. Plus, when you went there, they had all of the newspapers. People had read their newspaper and just left it there, and so you didn't even have to spend the $1.65 for a Saturday paper that was this thick. So you could sit there at the table and just pass pieces of this enormous paper back and forth with your friends, and that was a beautiful way to spend your Saturday or Sunday morning. Anyway, to wind it all up, um, if I do end up reincarnating in the 24th century when Picard is supposed to be living, I'm going to have an old fashioned kettle that I can boil water in. I'm going to have the same kind of tea we have today, little packets of tea, and I'm going to have a teapot and what about teacups? Well, I do like teacups, but they're not big enough. The old fashioned teacups. So I usually use like a large coffee mug for my tea, but I still like having teacups around, even though I rarely use them. I think it would be nice to have a tea party, but you know, modern day, it's very hard to get people together to have a tea party. Even to have people get together for dinner is very difficult because there's always some other reason why they can't have dinner. Well, I had coffee this morning, so I'm going to make myself a cup of boiled water tea. So, Patrick Stewart, if you're out there, um, maybe in a future episode of Picard, you'll make yourself a real cup of boiled tea with Earl Grey made by Tetley, perhaps. Why the Toronto Raptors? It just goes with this shirt. Why this shirt? Um, I'm getting tubby. I'm noticing that I'm developing a gut, and I'm totally disgusted with. I don't like being fat. Last night I was out, and there was a man that was 3 years older than me, and he was 650 pounds. But he drank beer because he was loaded. He was loaded. He was missing one of his front teeth. And, well, someone says, yes, and he was smoking marijuana. He was very jolly, like Santa Claus. He was having a wonderful time. But seriously, a man of 57 years old, 58 years old, should not have a stomach the size of Calcutta, the enormous city in India. That's how big his belly was. It was so big. And, my belly, you really can't even see it. But for me, I would prefer to look like an Olympic athlete. Not that I'm ever going to be 18 years old again, unless we get one of Corey Good's machines. You see, Corey Good says that there are advanced technologies to age regress you. And he said he himself spent 20 years in the secret space program, and then he was age regressed 20 years. So, well, I'd need more than 20 years taken off of me to be 18 again. But, to have an 18-year-old body and I don't know if I'd want my existing mind or if I'd want an age regress to 18 because some of my friends have got a new name. Now, sometimes when I'm on here, I use different stage names. And, we have Harry Weaver and we've got Bob Frizzell and we got George Gross and lots of other ones. But, the one that I use quite a bit when I'm not on camera is they call me Uncle, or sometimes it's DJ Uncle, but Uncle. And, well, they just came up with a new variation of Uncle, um, Grunkle. Grunkle? Yeah, I think it's Grunkle. It's like, like old people that are grandpas, they call them grumpas because they're grumpy, grumpa. So I'm grunkle because I'm quite often grumpy. And I think if I was age regressed back to 18, perhaps I wouldn't be grumpy. And, then I could relearn everything over again. And hopefully it's not the same brainwashing. I mean, like we're told so many lies. I'm still trying to figure out how to explain to people that I think it's fishy, the idea that DNA in our cells is what makes us human. I'm really, if there's the number one thing, my number one target on helping people understand that it doesn't make sense, it's the DNA. And a long time ago, on my Instagram, I took screenshots because I did an investigation using the internet to look at the people who originally discovered DNA. And when I was reading it, they had things there that were impossible. It sounded like they ordered up DNA from a scientific research supply house when they were doing experiments on discovering DNA. So I'm like, no, you're discovering DNA. How could they manufacture it, in some other city and supply you with DNA for your DNA? It sounds fishy. And then the other thing was, they said, I mean, this would have been, I don't know, early 1900, first half of the 1900s. And they took a glass container of some kind of a soup that had DNA in it. And then they took one of those plastic, well, a glass rod, and they dipped it into the beaker that had this DNA soup in it. And they pulled it out, and they had a thread of DNA hanging from this glass rod. I read that, and this was, supposed to be these original papers, and that's impossible because DNA is so tiny, according to their science. It's so tiny, it's in the nucleus of a cell. So, how are you going to get it all turned into something as thick as like corn syrup? You can pull it out of that's what I saw. And, maybe this is phony baloney, but this looked like old documents. And they said this was the original research. So I'm really coming to the conclusion that they bullshitted us about DNA. What could be the stuff that keeps us together? Well, the quantum simulation theory is that we're running a massive multiplayer video game, and we're inside the video game, and this is what it is. So it's all computer generated, and that's how come we can simulate a lot of what are we simulating? Well, we're simulating being in a body, for example. Simulated free will, simulated food, simulated everything because it's all quantum computer, and somehow whatever we are, being the point of awareness of it all, it's like we're in a 3D movie. But, other ways to explain it, I don't know. I've done so many of these videos. I don't want to make this any longer than it is. So I'm just going to cut you off right there and tell you, I really don't think DNA is real, which means all the DNA diseases are not real. They are part of the simulation. So if someone has got Down syndrome, trisomy 21, which means you've got the wrong number of chromosomes, and that results in that problem. It's simulated, and it is part of this game, someone's great idea. All kinds of horrible things that people experience are somehow, they're either part of the simulation or somebody is throwing monkey wrenches into the proper workings of our reality, and I haven't been able to prove it. It's only, following logic and intuition.